I want to recognize a couple elected officials, Mayor Weaver from Greenwood, and the county chairman of the Republican Party for here in Jackson County, Mark Anthony Jones. We're hoping that Sheriff Mike Sharp joins us, and we're hoping that State Representative Mike Searpoy joins us. Representative Searpoy is currently in the House, the majority leader, the floor leader in the Missouri House of Representatives, representing this district here in New Summit, and he's currently running in the 8th District special election here in November of this year. We've supported him. Representative Searpoy has been a great champion for medical cannabis from his powerful position in the House of Representatives. He's done a lot to aid us and kind of help push the majority of that body towards a reasonable solution for medical cannabis, and hopefully he makes it, but if he doesn't, you'll definitely be hearing from him about us. You'll also be hearing from us about David Martin over there. He is running as a Republican candidate for the 23rd district, which is in Kansas City, just east of Truce from Independence to about 35th Street. So we'll be working with him, and I swear we invited a couple Democrats, but including Jeff Gurley, who's the executive director of the Jackson County Democrats, and a high school friend of mine. But I guess they weren't able to make it. But I'm super glad you're here. I want to introduce Pastor Jim Whiting. I think most of you already know him, but Jim Whiting's been a great advocate for the cause, and I'll let him tell you more about what he's got going on, and then he'll introduce Dr. Sisley. And thank you, Jim.
All right. Some of you are going to get a double dose. I apologize for that. The first thing we need to realize is that we have to do more than who we are. We have to be really effective in communicating with people, because we're still dealing with some thoughts that haven't changed since the 60s. I mean, it is amazing that we're still dealing with this. I mentioned the reason how we got into this was my wife and I have 2 autistic boys, and one of which was pretty low on the spectrum. And I will tell you that when you have a child that bangs their head on the wall, bites themselves, runs, screams, and doesn't go to sleep for 72 hours, you're looking for anything to help that child. And I've been through that, my wife and I have, and there was a period of time that on our oldest son, I probably gave him over 100 pills a week. Not as many as you, but still a lot. And it hurt. And I think to this day he's suffering from that. I wish I had knowledge of medical cannabis for our son in 1986. I found a friend, a really good friend, who invited me to his house, and he showed me the benefit of medical cannabis on his son, who was in a similar spectrum in autism. I was amazed. Began spending significant time, as I said earlier this morning, researching medical cannabis. And as you know, as a bishop in the ministry, as a Christian, when I took the position of supporting medical cannabis, there were many people who did not like my position. I have not changed. I will not change. It is a wonderful solution without harm for our children with autism. It just is. And you know, I will say just one other thing, because it's amazing how things transpire if you're a pastor. Tuesday, I met an old friend, as I said earlier today, hadn't seen in 10 years, suffering so much from Parkinson's. So hard for Larry just to work. He has a body and automobile repair shop in Blue Springs. And I thought to myself, how many people I have seen because of relationships that the condition can be significantly improved with medical cannabis. Saturday we'll be at a baby shower for a young lady whose mother, when I was pastoring in Lone Jack, a small church there, had cancer. And it was a long, drawn out, tough experience for everyone. When I see the cures that are available for cancer with cannabis, with autism, with Tourette's, with Parkinson's. It's hard for me to understand how anybody would not consider this one of God's great creations for mankind. One of God's creations for mankind. And we, as stewards of that, we need to really promote it. I think it is unbelievably fantastic to have Dr. Sisley here, because she has come into an environment that really needs her knowledge, her cutting-edge science, her experience. They need to hear it. Unfortunately, they're not here. We're going to broadcast it. Acts Ministry reaches, 300,000 people every month in Missouri. They're going to hear it, just like they heard Dr. Mobley, who wrote most of the cannabis laws in Oregon. They're going to hear it because we can make a difference, even as small, maybe insignificant to the big crowds. We can make a difference, and she is a big piece of that. So I turn it over. It's always dangerous to leave a podium to a pastor. I turn it over to the person you're here for to see, because she will make Dr. Sue Sisley.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Did you guys just say you had Mowgli here? From Philo's Bioscience?
No, he's down in Springfield.
Yeah.
That's him.
Wow, okay. I'm just going to take this off as I'm a little warm. Even though I'm from the desert, I'm not used to the humidity here. It's a little, I'm just going to jump right into this, because I know I really appreciate you guys getting up so early for this. Oh, perfect timing. Look at that. See how that works? You came right away with the cord. That worked out great. Thank you, guys. All right, perfect. Let me just tell you a little bit more about the trial he just mentioned. So we're doing an FDA-approved clinical trial looking at 4 different varieties of whole plant cannabis in military veterans that have PTSD. So this is the trial we're best known for. These are our current collaborators. They've changed a lot over the years due to people being afraid to participate in this work. But I can tell you that, basically I've been practicing, I see patients full-time. I'm not a full-time researcher. So I'm mostly a primary care physician, where I see most of my patients now over telemedicine. But just my disclosures are that I've never participated in the cannabis industry, meaning I don't own grows or dispensaries or any of that. So I'm just interested in the science. I don't write, recommendations for patients. The first bullet point was true for the first 46 years of my life. I never tried cannabis in any formulation until this year. I turned 47 and suddenly got breast cancer, and I ended up going through all the usual treatment, the lumpectomy, radiation, all that. But I decided to reject chemo and just use a high kind of a high potency THC oil. And the reason I came to that decision was because some of my colleagues at the University of Arizona have been doing this work. This was published in a peer-reviewed journal, where these are breast tumor cells in a petri dish, and basically they're introducing a synthetic cannabinoid and documenting a very dramatic reduction in the density of these cells. And here's another example of his work, where these are mice models where they've given these mice cancer, and they demonstrated here that with cannabis, the chance of metastasis from the primary tumor was considerably lower in the mice who had cannabis. So this is a little bit more about my background. I worked at the VA for years. I've taken care of veterans now for 20 years. I ended up eventually at the U of A College of Medicine, where I was in excellent standing until I became the PI on a cannabis study, and that suddenly put me at odds with an administration that did not value this work and really felt that it would hurt their brand. And ultimately it worked out to be a really a gift for us. Being terminated from the U of A enabled us to shine a big spotlight on the barriers to cannabis research. So it was really valuable in the end. But so a lot of people would think that being fired from your medical school would be professionally devastating. But in our case, we were able to leverage that into millions of dollars in free media coverage, and we ended up opening up our own institute. So now we're happily independent from any university or hospital. We're not beholden to any of these folks. We're going through a private IRB committee. And after being terminated, we also got a $2 million grant from the state of Colorado, which is our first government grant ever, to study efficacy of cannabis for PTSD. And I just want to point out one thing here. Let me just show you, just to give you a little bit of hope about some future trials that are coming up. You can see here, we were one of 8 grants that were funded by the state of Colorado. So this is what I'm hoping will happen here in Missouri, which is why we've been collaborating with Eapan here to try to organize a regulated medical cannabis market here. Because for Colorado, just on their medical market, they have raised $13 million just in pure surplus that was just sitting in their, the health department account, not doing anything. The legislature decided to take 10 million of that 13 million and plow it into efficacy research. So I was really impressed with the government, because the government in Colorado is actually really conservative. I think people think Colorado's a bunch of hippie liberals, and it's not true. That actually the elected officials there are super conservative, but the fact that they understood that we couldn't rely on our federal government to provide money for efficacy research. All our government wants to do right now is safety studies looking at harmful side effects. So they've put 10 million into this. So over the next 5 years, you're going to see data published in all of these areas: cannabis for inflammatory bowel disease, cannabis for pediatric brain tumors. All of this will be coming to light. So I'm really excited to see that happen. This is the reason we've been fighting so hard for this study, because it's the first and only randomized controlled trial in the world looking at cannabis for PTSD. So it's really an important issue that needs to get figured out. So this is, if any of you are physicians in the room, you may know that this is the DEA Schedule I license. Normally, if you're a regular, practicing physician, you have a Schedule 2 through 5. But here, this is a Schedule I license, and this is what scientists call the golden ticket, because it's hard to get, but it allows you, once you get approved, you are allowed the privilege of purchasing cannabis from our federal government. And I would say privilege in quotes, because it's actually, I'm going to show you some pictures of what that looks like. So when initially when the cannabis, when we were allowed to order cannabis, I figured, I ordered 8 kilos. That was what we needed to complete the entire trial. And I was thinking, well, surely this would come by armored truck or whatever, and suddenly there's the FedEx guy shows up with a cooler. It's basically a cooler full of frozen cannabis. He had no idea he was even transporting cannabis. I was so mystified how this could even happen. He was wondering what all the cameras were doing, but we were just it was so historic. We fought for 7 years to get this study underway, and we wanted to document this. But you can see this is how it arrives in sandwich bags full of frozen powder. This is basically, when you dump it out, you see it's like a green talcum powder. And that's what we're forced to use. So this is what's frustrating is, when you look at the natural plant, this doesn't resemble what we have probably, what you've seen as the natural flower. But this is it. This is the only federally legal supply of cannabis for research. And so here's the challenge is, when none of the scientists in our country have ever done secondary testing on the cannabis. That was crucial to me, because I felt like I didn't want to give cannabis to veterans and not at least be able to know what's in it. So we tried, embarked on this whole odyssey because you can't just send it to a lab. You've got to send it to an analytical lab with a DEA Schedule I license. There's a whole chain of command, and they won't tell you who has a Schedule I license. The DEA says it's a secret, it's confidential. So we went through the process of trying to find this, and this is actually the placebo. So I wanted to point out that the government does provide us a placebo for controlled trials, and this is the same plant that you saw in the other batches. It's just this has been alcohol washed where they leach out all the cannabinoids. So in our testing, we verified that this is truly like inert plant material. It doesn't have any cannabinoids or terpenes in it. But eventually, after our lab testing was completed, we went public with the data. We felt it was important to be transparent about this, and so we ended up, this article went viral. There were literally hundreds of other articles that spawned off of this, talking about the quality of the federal government. So the challenge is that this is the only study drug we've ever been allowed to use since 1968. And so what it's always kind of mystified me is why the patient reports about how they're reacting to cannabis have been so impressive. Like people are having very transformative experiences with cannabis, but yet the data doesn't always seem to reflect that. The controlled trial, and that's why scientists have been wondering now for a while if those studies are being sabotaged by the quality of the cannabis, and the fact that you're trying to measure effectiveness of cannabis using what most people would view as a very low quality material. So after we went public, we found that there were excessively high levels of mold and lead in the initial testing, and when we went public with this, we immediately lost our partner, Johns Hopkins. They dropped out. A day later, I got a letter from their general counsel saying they're out. And what I found out later was that, of course, they receive $2 billion in federal money every year, and they don't want to be associated with any scientists that are critical of the government. So that made a lot of sense to me, and they were difficult partners anyway to work with. So we're happily moving forward with the study now on our own. We're continuing to actively enroll patients, and we're making some headway. But in the meantime, I wanted to mention that the DEA did announce last year that they were going to end this monopoly on their research cannabis grow, and they were going to allow they were going to approve other growers for research. But unfortunately, that was not accompanied by any timetable. So we, when the DEA makes an announcement without letting you know what the timeline is, you can rest assured that it may not happen for many, many years. So that's unfortunate. But in the meantime, I want to just give you a glimpse of how we ended up in this arena. This is not my, I didn't go through medical school thinking I would be a cannabis researcher, but it was really the veterans who taught me about their experiences with cannabis and kind of led me through this. They were reporting that they were benefiting from cannabis in all of these areas, and I was very skeptical at that time. It was about 10 years ago that they started kind of reluctantly disclosing to me that they were using the plant and that they were getting relief for all of these symptoms. And I couldn't really wrap my head around because I'd been trained in a really conservative medical model. I was actually trained at the University of Arizona Medical School, where we were ultimately terminated. But I finally, started to wake up as I began losing patients in my own practice. I've lost a lot of veterans to suicide over the last, primarily over the last 10 years. I started to see that these guys were, and that I didn't have any other treatment options. We really have very few treatments available. So you can see this is, this data, everybody believes now, is falsely low. So 20 a day is actually probably much lower than the real number, because most of the patients who died in my practice of suicide died of prescription drug overdose. And prescription drug overdose is not classified often as suicide. It's usually listed as an accident on the death report. So this is the challenge. Even the VA is kind of patting themselves on the back that they've managed to get the number from 22 a day to 20 a day. But we all know these numbers are wildly inaccurate and don't come close to what's happening in the real world. But it's already a horrific number, right? It's already this should be considered a public health crisis in the same way our opioid epidemic is being viewed. The government should be pulling out all the stops to address this, and really we're not seeing that kind of action. We're not seeing them attempting to, here's a perfect example, a study that might uncover a new treatment for PTSD. Instead of the government embracing it and fast tracking it, instead they have stonewalled the study every step of the way. They have managed to do everything they can to impede this work.
So I'm going to pause you right there. He doesn't have much time, so I want to recognize that he's here, but Sheriff Sharp, thank you for being here. I just want to tell you, Sheriff Sharp has been extremely valuable to us, advocating for his family up in Jefferson City. And when we get this done, it's going to be in large part because the barrier for law enforcement is really broken by having an executive elected law enforcer from one of Missouri's largest and most populous counties step forward and say that it's time to get this done and do the right thing for Missouri.
Taking a lot of heat on that, sir?
No, not
Not really? Good.
No, we're good. I think we've had a couple flip over.
Good.
Join me.
Times are changing.
Platte County.
Yep, Sheriff Owen, Platte County's marvelous.
Good.
Mike, can you come up here? I'd like to get a picture of you. With
Before you sneak out.
He didn't put his makeup on this morning.
I love it. I wish we could.
Sorry, I'm running late. We've got a lot of stuff going on.
No, thank you, sir. I
So nice to
appreciate
meet
you. Yeah, thank you. I wish we could bring you out to Arizona.
Well, I'll go to Arizona.
Yeah.
I have to go too.
This way.
No, I don't blame you.
Mom wants to go, huh?
Yeah.
There you go.
Leave me.
Anyway, so I was mentioning to you guys that there's very few treatments available for PTSD. Actually, the only two FDA-approved treatments are Zoloft and Paxil. Many people are surprised to understand that because, we all know that the PTSD is treated with so many different meds, but those are all being used off-label. So the media has started to acknowledge this. They're admitting that many of the meds that are being used to treat PTSD are really no better than placebo. And what's happened now is we're seeing the prescription drug overdose, the death rate is considerably higher among the veteran community, and that's in large part due to the, us and the physician community, because we continue to pummel these vets with so many prescriptions. Most of them are not helpful. They end up stockpiling them at home, and then in an hour of darkness, they end up overdosing on them. So this is why it's also heartbreaking to see this. But I think what's been really impressive is the way the veteran community has learned, has discovered cannabis on their own and has learned how to utilize it and has managed to substitute many of their more addictive medications instead using this natural plant. So I've been that's why I've learned so much from them about how they've used cannabis as sort of a substitution therapy for opioids and benzos. This is an interesting dynamic too. I just threw this up because I want to point out that there's some articles, like in the New York Times a few months ago, there was an article talking about how certain insurance companies were now paying for cannabis. I didn't think I would ever see this like in the next decade, but the insurance companies are, fiscally smart. They acknowledge that cannabis could save them a lot of money because these guys are getting off a lot of the more expensive pharma drugs. So what happens is the insurance companies just reimburse the patient directly. They're not paying a dispensary for the medicine. The patient will say, I'm using, $600 a month for my, my cannabis, and they'll submit a receipt, and the insurance company will reimburse them. So I think this is a good trend. It's not happening with any of the big insurance companies like Cigna or Blues, but it's a good start, and I think we'll be able to prove some things there to other insurance companies. And this is probably the most important article, for the cannabis movement over the last decade. This JAMA article because it's such a respected peer-reviewed journal, to have something like this, and this is an article documenting that in the 23 medical cannabis states, that there was over a 25% reduction in opioid overdose deaths in those states. And sure, you may not be able to make a direct cause and effect relationship from this data, but it's certainly an important trend, and it clearly shows that patients are choosing, cannabis as a safer alternative to opioids in these states, and then not having to face these kind of fatalities as often. So this was also something that really changed my mind about cannabis when I spent a lot of time. We have many of my co-investigators in Israel and I sat with veterans who were picking up their medicine in Israel, and I was so stunned to see that the government there completely pays for the cost of the veterans' cannabis there. So it's not just that they have legal access, but they have complete sponsorship from the federal government. Same thing with this is a gentleman who, this was his first time using cannabis, so he had to be taught how to do it, and that's what they do in these clinics. They sit down with you and teach you how to utilize the medicine, and we have veteran groups here in the U.S. and that look at their colleagues in Israel and Canada and say, why can't this be the way our American, government treats us? And so you're seeing all these new veteran groups starting to surface that are questioning the government about why can't they have a similar system in place here. And this is a group in Canada, Marijuana for Trauma. It's a charity where it's a kind of a peer mentoring model where the vets teach each other how to use cannabis. In Canada, for instance, they are allowed up to 3 grams a day. The government, a gram is just think about it as 1 rolled joint. So you think that they're allowed up to 3 joints per day, which is, substantial, covers what most of in our study, for instance, we give veterans up to 2 grams a day. So I think this is a really good model, and the fact is the sky hasn't fallen in Canada, and veterans aren't out of control and rampaging there, it's a really reasonable model. And here's some other groups that are trying to do the same work. Let me just fly through this part because I want to take you through some other stuff here about let's just see here. This is the list of qualifying conditions in Hawaii. I just use this as an example because it's pretty similar to what the other states do. So you can see this is a typical of all the 29 medical cannabis states. These are the most common qualifying conditions for a card. I want to just point out some of the data that supports this. So you can see, when you keep hearing continually that there's not enough science to support cannabis as a medicine, I want you to look at, use reports like this to help, kind of support your position. This is probably the biggest breakthrough that's happened in a long time, is the NAS, which is the National Academy of Science. They issued a report in January. I mean, remember, National Academy of Science is one of the most respected federal agencies in the world of science. So for them to release a report in January this year concluding that cannabis is a medicine and verifying, so what happened was this really prestigious commission of scientists from around the world came together. They reviewed 10,000 journal articles on cannabis, and they ranked them in terms of scientific credibility, and they determined that there was strong scientific evidence to support cannabis as a medicine for treating chronic pain, for treating nausea and vomiting, and for treating multiple sclerosis. And then I'll show you too, there was also some other areas that had moderate scientific evidence. For instance, at the issue of epilepsy, we all know that cannabis is demonstrating efficacy in treating seizure disorder, but it may not have enough data to rise to the level of strong evidence, but still, these are the areas that have the most strong science to back them. And you can see here, I want to give you an example of what the problems are and why you're not seeing more stronger research data to support cannabis as a medicine. This is one of my colleagues, Don Abrams, who's incredibly talented scientist, and most of the studies that you see over the last few decades all have this fixed dosing model, which that's what I've become opposed to this because I feel that this is harming our ability to demonstrate efficacy. Here's an example of, this is a pain study that he did that clearly showed that cannabis does help with pain, but the problem was that he forced people into 25 milligrams TID. So they had to take 25 milligrams 3 times a day, whether they needed it or not. And that's the issue is with, when you do that, sometimes, these guys need far less than that in many cases. And so all you end up doing is sort of eclipsing any of the therapeutic benefit with, this is a fairly big side effect profile, which is unusual, right? Cannabis is usually very well tolerated, has very minimal side effects. But in this case, the side effects were much higher than placebo, and that's, we believe, because when you force people to take more than they need, of course, they're gonna have more side effects and then possibly not be reporting as big efficacy as you would expect. So that's the whole reason in our study we fought for a patient self-titration model, and the FDA was very opposed to this initially because you can imagine the FDA is all physician investigators, so the FDA does not want any other model except fixed dosing. So in our case, we understood though that patient self-titration, when it comes to botanical medicine, patient self-titration is the most optimal approach, starting with the lowest amount, going up slowly, empowering the patient to do what they, what they feel is right for themselves. And that's the challenge, is the plant is so complex. Every patient responds to it uniquely, and so you can't force people, you can't pigeonhole them into a specific dose, at least not right now. Maybe over the next 20 years we'll get more sophisticated sort of pharma dosing, but right now this is the patient self-titration, I believe, is the best model. And here you can see this was another impressive change in thinking, was Nora Volkow, who's the head of NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Nora is like one of the biggest anti-marijuana crusaders in the country, but even she had to admit in a recent lecture she gave at NIH, this is her slide where she shows that that cannabis is a reasonable treatment option for pain. So I never thought I would see this happen, but she's been one of our biggest adversaries. But this is an example of a drug that is available right now through GW Pharmaceutical called Sativex. You may have heard of this. I want to just point out that there's nothing special about this. This is going to be probably over $10,000 a month when GW Pharma gets this on the market, which they will. But there's nothing special. All it is a oral mucosal extract. So it's a simple tincture of a 1-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD. That's it. You can buy that in any retail, in any of these 29 states. You can buy the same thing for maybe under $100. So I want to just mention this because I'm not opposed to pharma. I want them to be able to innovate and do their thing, but I think that natural botanical medicine should be allowed to compete with them on the shelf, and that's my beef with GW and all these other pharmaceutical companies, is that they're trying to suppress the research on whole plant medicine, on natural raw plant, because they know that the efficacy is really in the natural plant. They know that they can't compete with that efficacy, and so their only hope is to be able to isolate a cannabinoid and patent it and put it into a pill or a bottle like this. And that's my frustration. I'm not saying I think these should be on the market, but I don't think they should be as a substitute for the natural plant. And I think that's what we all should be, advocating, that whole plant should be allowed to compete on its own. And here's another, so when people tell you, again, there's no data, to support cannabis for pain, and that they think that all the whole, you'll see in these legal states that they're always trying to keep pain off of the qualifying condition list, right? Because they think it'll open the floodgates and everybody will claim they have pain. Well, the fact is there is substantial data. I know you can't see the detail, but I'm just trying to show you that here's 8 or so clinical trials published in peer-reviewed journals showing cannabis efficacy for pain. So it's not just stoners trying to get high. These are legit controlled data. Here's the data on cannabis for multiple sclerosis. It's not, nobody made this up. These are legitimate trials overseen by an IRB committee documenting, especially for spasticity. We met a young woman yesterday at that event who has severe spasticity from cerebral palsy, and the only thing that's ever helped her is cannabis. Spasticity is very difficult to treat, whether it's from MS or any other neurologic condition, and there's not very good meds on the market, so this is, in many cases, a much better option. And this is the study that made me realize that we're on the right track with our research. There's tons of trials looking at cannabis for PTSD, but none of them are controlled trials. That's the issue. So we have tons of observational studies like this one. This is an observational study, but it was published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, and it verifies, he followed 80 veterans through the New Mexico medical cannabis program, and he documented a 75% reduction in PTSD symptoms, which is really hard to do. I can't achieve that with standard meds. I couldn't get there. But the fact that cannabis was able to give them that much relief, and this was also, documented with CAPS scores, which is the exact measurement that we're using in our study. CAPS is the gold standard for measuring severity of PTSD. So it's a really good designed study and gave us some good data. So maybe I'll go into this a little bit because I was gonna try to talk about, but I think this is kind of, I understand that Missouri is a big football state, huh? Who likes football here? Anybody?
It's a love-hate relationship.
I love it.
Baseball,
You
Kevin
really
Doyle.
don't like it all,
Oh,
because you can feel it every day.
Well, this was something I want to just point out, because people are really interested in the anti-inflammatory action of cannabis, and so I want to just, so when we talk about patients with stroke, we always talk about time is brain and how important it is to get these guys into the ER quickly and get their brain reperfused with blood so that they can get oxygen to the tissues. So here's the inflammatory pathway. When you have a stroke, this is all the inflammatory action that occurs during a stroke. But with cannabis, we're already proving that cannabinoids are able to block these different elements of the inflammatory pathway and possibly reduce some of the impact of an event like that. Here's another thing I want to point out. If you go on clinicaltrials.gov, this is one of the, it's a kind of a central database to look at all research that's happening, any clinical trials. The challenge is, so when you put in cannabis as a search tool here, you'll end up seeing, actually this is old, it's probably now over 600 studies looking at cannabis. But the disappointing part of this is that 99% of these trials are all safety studies looking at harmful side effects or addiction potential, because that's what the government pays for, right? So as I talked about earlier, the government, what drives scientists to do work is where is the funding? And if the funding is only available to study safety and not efficacy, then that's where scientists will put their efforts. So unfortunately, what we're hoping is as people like you start to build a bigger voice with elected officials, hopefully you'll be able to change the balance of the funding, where eventually we'll be able to shift monies toward efficacy research instead of just safety study. But anyway, I want to just point out, when I went to med school, they told us that that nerve tissue cannot regenerate, that it's not, once a neuron is dead, it's dead. And so we always believed that. My mom too is a physician, and all through her training they taught her that. And then what happened is now we're starting to see scientific literature that suggests that cannabis could be involved in brain repair, which is something we didn't believe could happen, but now we're seeing that cannabis, that the cannabinoids interact with these receptors, what we call the endocannabinoid system, and promote neurogenesis, which is basically the generation of new nervous tissue. So this is really exciting. I mean, no question about it. This could be really, really groundbreaking. This is for those of you who do care about football. I just want to point out something. We started working with the NFL players who were having, kind of persistent neurologic deficits from their repeated concussions. And so I started, I'm not a football fan at all, but I became aware, that this problem with, just look at this depiction. I mean, this is one season of a college football player and 500 impacts to the head in one season. So you think about these guys who spend a career from junior high all the way to, the end of their NFL career, how many times they're hit in the head. It's terrible. And so here's the depiction of what that is, right? When they get a concussion, it's actually the brain pounding on the skull and then bouncing backwards and pounding on the back of the skull. So you get contusions on both sides of the brain every single time this happens. It's just the brain just floating in the skull, bouncing around. And you can see here that this is, actually I wanted to just point it, so this causes this whole cascade of the inflammation, the activation of these inflammatory cells, which you'll see here. Let me show you. Actually, let me just mention this too. So this is a study that these guys were doing, looking at cannabis for Alzheimer's. Now, I want to point out, Alzheimer's is only rarely seen as a qualifying condition in medical marijuana states, but it's an important area. In Arizona, for instance, we do have Alzheimer's added, and because we have a huge senior population in Arizona, and people are understanding that cannabis may play a role in a couple different ways. So in our case, in Arizona, we have it approved for agitation of Alzheimer's, like to try to treat all the behavioral problems associated with that type of dementia. And so we've been seeing really good results where patients are able to get off a lot of the more toxic antipsychotics and things like that, because that was the go-to, right? Every time I had an Alzheimer's patient, I would write them for Seroquel and all these other really lousy antipsychotics, even though they have a obvious black box warning on them saying do not use in elderly patients, and still doctors would routinely go to that. But now what we're seeing is that cannabis can suppress, kind of gently suppress a lot of the more severe behavioral problems without causing them to be so sedated, right? So they can be alert and manage their psychiatric complications. But the other more interesting thing is when we talked earlier about neurogenesis, you kind of wonder if cannabis could be used prophylactically. If you start cannabis treatment early on, could you maybe prevent the progression of Alzheimer's? We don't know that yet, but it's certainly an interesting research question. I think we're gonna get more data on that slowly. And then I just want to point out that we're starting to make some headway with the NFL. We launched a campaign over a year ago to try to persuade them to look at the data on cannabis for neuroprotection. And the players union is finally now, after a year of us harassing them, is finally starting to come out and admit that this may be an important discussion. They're talking about adding it to the collective bargaining agreement in 2020. So, and here you can see, this is our campaign, right? So we wrote an open letter to the NFL, to the league, and to the media demanding that they end the ban on cannabis in the NFL. So I wanted to end with this because I think this is important. People probably are like, well, why are you even involved in this? You're a scientist, you don't care about football, but I recognize that this is an important potential culture shift, right? The NFL, people are fascinated about football. It cuts across all red and blue states. The thinking of, conservatives and liberals they're all captivated by football. And so if the NFL makes this kind of culture shift, it could have widespread change in people's thinking about how cannabis should be viewed. So, and by the way, and so the other thing we've been fighting with the NFL to provide meaningful opioid education to these guys, because one of the things we see is that the players just get pummeled with mega dosages of opioids and are never told about the risks. So all these players, when I interview them later, they're like, nobody ever told, but yet when a doctor, these are given out by team doctors who have a responsibility to provide informed consent to patients, right? Every time I prescribe a drug to somebody, I have to tell them about risks and benefits. Nobody's doing that with these guys because they're all just putting them, pummeling them with opioids and then tossing them back on the field and, getting back out there. So we're hoping to, and the other important thing is this $100 million was, Roger Goodell put this out last year that he was going to, through that concussion settlement, the lawsuit on the concussions, he was going to allocate $100 million to research player wellness. And so that's another reason I got involved in this, because I was hoping we could persuade the NFL to earmark some of that, even a few $1,000,000, to start to look at cannabis as a neuroprotectant in these players. But he hasn't agreed to do that. He said that he doesn't feel the science is there. I think there's a quote from him. But the good news is that the owners are starting to get involved now. So we have a few owners who've agreed to come out publicly and talk about the need to change the policy and to do research. Even Jerry Jones, you probably saw him come out recently and admit that this is important. We're having more active players now talking openly, which is really hard to do, because remember what happened at Eugene Monroe from the Ravens. He had, one that had like a $25 million contract with the Baltimore Ravens, and as soon as he came out publicly against the ban on cannabis, he was released from the Ravens 2 months later. So it's really risky. You put a big target on your back when they don't want cannabis, to be associated with their brand, their what they call the shield or whatever. So this is my point is that with this is to say that look, you got marijuana patients all around you. This isn't something that's isolated to certain age groups anymore. In Arizona, our biggest population of medical cannabis cards goes to our senior population in Arizona. So it's important. A lot of elected officials think these are just like 20 to 30-year-olds that are abusing cannabis, but it's not true. And here's an example. These dispensaries, this is not even an elegant one. I gotta tell you, this is probably the most unimpressive, but I just happened to get a shot of it. But we in Arizona we have over 150 dispensaries statewide, and they really look like medical clinics. They're not, and that's one of the things that maybe I'll end it on this because I know you guys have to go. But I want to just mention that our interaction with the legislators yesterday at the Capitol was really impressive. These guys are hungry for information, but they're really they have sort of a very naive view in many cases of what this program will look like. And so I tried to systematically invite every one of those elected officials and their staffers to come to Arizona and see what a regulated market is, because a lot of these guys were asking questions like, how does the patient get the cannabis? Is it put through pharmacies and all that? And I realized, God, if they would just come and see the system firsthand, it would give them so much comfort to see how elegant this process works, how it's every minute of this process from seed to sale is monitored by the Department of Health, who it manages this, and it's still budget neutral, even with all this type of regulatory framework. The fact is that we are now in Arizona have over a $20 million surplus just from our medical cannabis program. So it's not a drain on the budget. You're you're giving a gift to the sick and debilitated people of the state and enabling them to have safe, legal access to lab-tested cannabis. That's just such an important gift. And it's just so basic. So I think that might be, maybe I'll just show you a glimpse in this too, because this is one of the things you'll probably hear all the time is that, they don't want people smoking pot in Missouri. But I want to just point out all the different formulations we have in Arizona and in every legal state you can get. Oops, sorry, these people. pictures, but you can get everything from oils, you know, tinctures, lozenges, capsules. Oh, I wanted to point this out. This is pretty cool. So my mom, I said, is a retired physician. She got a squamous cell cancer and she refused to have surgery. She's like, she's 82. She's like, I don't want them touching me. So so she applied this high THC oil to this lesion every day for a month. And this is the repeat biopsy showing normal, you know, basically that the cancer had went into remission. And so I was highly skeptical. I was like, God, this is never gonna work. I thought this was so dumb. And then suddenly even the pathologist was just stunned by this. The pathologist did a second and third read on this slide because they couldn't believe that this had happened. But what's interesting is topical cancers especially are really susceptible to the anti-cancer activity of cannabis. And cannabis does have anti-cancer activity, but we have to be really careful not to like overstate that, because people who make all these sort of outlandish claims about curing cancer are doing kind of a disservice to this movement. So, but it is reasonable to say that there is anti-cancer activity that's already been documented in the scientific literature at the receptor level. This is an example of, you know, when this happened, we put together a case report and have submitted it to the Journal of Dermatology, and of course haven't been accepted yet because, again, these are things that are difficult to get through peer review. Peer review doesn't like cannabis stuff, and they don't want literature that they feel like this is kind of pseudoscience. But you know, this is the only way we're going to break through, is if individual physicians who see these experiences can document them in a case report and get them into the literature. Anyway, this is what we want to work with. So when it comes to research, I would love to just be able to work with the flower. Instead, what I'm getting is this ground up mixture of leaves and stems, and the problem with that is that our study drug is distributed to patients by weight. So if half of the weight of the study drug is extraneous plant material, what we'd like to do is just utilize this. So the one thing you can do if you care about cannabis research, the most important thing to do in Missouri is get a regulated market here so that we can first start to do observational studies on patients who are using the natural plant and using a lab-tested version so that we can actually follow the chemical profile of what patients are using and how they're responding to it clinically. So that's essential, that we get a market in place here as soon as possible. And then the next thing is, when it comes to controlled trials, is continuing to put pressure on the DEA to license other growers for research. It's unconscionable that this has been a government enforced monopoly at the University of Mississippi since 1968. They've enjoyed this monopoly. It is time to dismantle this monopoly and allow scientists to have access to natural flower instead of this kind of mishmash of junk, that we're getting. So those are the two things. If I can leave you with a call to action, it's those two things. Let's get this bill passed. Let's get a medical market legal here and start developing observational studies here that we can start to, publish data, and then to end the DEA monopoly and license other growers. So I thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Just a quick thing that you can do for what just happened, okay? If you've got a piece of paper or got good memory, we'll go to your Facebook. I'm certain everyone in this room has got a Facebook. Go to your Facebook and send your reaction, post it on Acts Media Group. Okay, we will take that and we will put it on Acts Television, and we will broadcast your reactions and what's going on today to all over this state. We'll hit about 350,000 people, and I'm going to tell you something, they will hear it, because we will play it again and again and again, and then we'll target it, because that's the kind of information they need to hear. We need to get rid of that ignorance and get some intelligence in our decision process. And I love her comment about football. Not that I know this guy, but I know somebody that's right shoulder has driven him crazy since he left Alabama playing football. And if it wasn't for a Mama Doc rub, don't record this. If it wasn't for a Mama Doc rub that's full spectrum,
Close in prayer here in a few minutes, but I just